Welcome to the Green Urbanist podcast, where we explore sustainable placemaking, climate action in cities, and urban rewilding. I'm your host, Ross O'Kelly, an urban designer, educator, and sustainable placemaking consultant. Today's episode is a conversation with Mike Berners-Lee.
I'm Mike Berners-Lee. I'm a professor at Lancaster University. I run a business called Small World Consulting, which helps other businesses of every kind you can think of to make an appropriate response to the climate and ecological emergency. And I've written some books. First one, How Bad Are Bananas? The Carbon Footprint of Everything. More recently, There's No Planet B. And I'm just about to publish my fourth book, A Climate of Truth, Why We Need It and How to Get It.
In the episode, we discuss the different aspects of the polycrisis that we're facing, of which climate change is one. And we talk about the central argument of his new book, A Climate of Truth, which is that we need to raise the standards of honesty in our politics, our media, and our business if we are going to address the polycrisis and the challenges that we're facing. Here's my conversation with Mike. So let's talk about your new book, A Climate of Truth. I guess the real question is, what motivated you to write it? And tell us a bit about the premise and why you've written this book, basically.
Well, I've been working on climate and sustainability for over 20 years now. And when I began, it looked like the most useful thing to do was to try and look at carbon footprints so we could all understand where carbon was in the world and in our lives. And it was clear that was necessary, but turns out, of course, not to be sufficient to get the change we need. And so I wrote a book with Duncan Clark called The Burning Question, which was a big picture take on climate change. This is 12 years ago or so, pointing out some essential things about the dynamics of climate change to see if that would make a difference. And we're still not getting anywhere on climate. And then it had become clear that it was, if you wanted to deal with climate, you needed to treat it as actually just one symptom of something much bigger that's going on in the world. Our arrival in the Anthropocene, if you like, the era in which humans are the biggest thing affecting the ecosystem. But A Climate of Truth is really saying, look, it's clear that the Anthropocene challenge is huge for us. We are accelerating into a polycrisis. Maybe not just a polycrisis, a meta-crisis. In other words, it's got deeper levels as well. And the truth is, we are not getting anywhere at all. In fact, we're accelerating into it. So if you just take the climate dimension of it, the science that is telling us that climate is a big deal that we need to be doing something about has been absolutely clear for at least 3 decades. And so we've had 30 climate COPs to try and sort that out. But while those COPs have been going on, the carbon curve has been going up and up. In other words, the rate at which we're putting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere has been rising, not falling. In other words, every year we are making the climate worse by a larger amount than we made it worse by the year before. So in other words, our efforts are absolutely futile at the moment. Some people, in a very well-intentioned way, say things like we're making progress but not fast enough. That's not true. The facts are against them. The facts are we're going backwards. We are accelerating into the problem. So I wrote this book because I don't want that to continue, right? So if we keep failing, right, if we keep having these climate conferences that don't get us anywhere, and plenty of well-intentioned people like me, including me, have been sort of screaming ever more clearly for years about how we've got to do something about this, and it's not getting us anywhere, then it's time to take stock and look at the problem in new ways, right? We need to stand right back. We need to get a bigger perspective on what's going on than we've had before. We need to unpick the reasons behind the reasons why we're not making any progress. We need to join up the dots of the challenge much better. And when we've done all that, we need to see what emerges as a point of leverage that could start to change the dial for the first time. So I wrote this book for people who don't want to spend their lives complaining that no one's taking any notice, that the world's not taking any notice, on the issues that matter to them the most and are of the most critical importance. I wrote this book for people who want to see some change at last, even in the face of the knowledge that nothing so far has worked.
Wow, I think for a lot of people listening, that's probably quite a hard-hitting way to start the conversation. I suppose you've done this sort of very global scale analysis. Can you tell? You've used this term, the polycrisis. So let's dig into that a little bit. What does that mean, maybe for people who aren't so familiar with it?
Okay, well, where it comes from, first of all, is the fact that humans are becoming more and more powerful. You know, our energy supply goes up and up every year, and we use that energy to do all kinds of wonderful things, including developing new technologies, and those technologies allow us to do more and more of ever more wonderful things. And it's all great, except for the fact that through our use of energy and technology, we increasingly influence the planet through a mixture of accident and design. And we've now got to the point where we are so powerful that unless we are more careful than we've ever needed to be throughout history, we find ourselves smashing the place up. And that's where we are now. If you like, it's a result of the imbalance between our power and the wisdom with which we wield that power. And it's taking us into a situation where we are hurtling into a polycrisis of physical challenges that are all getting out of hand. So the climate crisis we hear most about, and that's to do with pumping greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere through burning fossil fuel mainly, but through other things as well. But alongside that, we also have a nature crisis because, most notably, because the way that we're doing our food system has been hemorrhaging our biodiversity and also ruining our soils to the point that those soils won't carry on producing the food that we require in the same way if we keep going about it in the same way. Whilst we deal with the food and the climate dimensions of the crisis, we also have a rising population, and the more of us there are, the more pressure that puts on the system. We have rising pollution, which is really starting to be a much bigger problem than many people realize. So if you look at plastics, for example, the rate of plastics growth is about 4 or 5% per year, which is much faster than the rate of fossil fuel growth has ever been. And those plastics turn out to be absolutely permanent. They turn out to bring with them health impacts which we're only just starting to understand. They're ruining our fertility, they're giving us cancer, they're clogging up organs in our body through microplastics, and they're filling us full of endocrine disruptors that disrupt our hormone systems. And we're arguably at least as addicted to plastic as we are to fossil fuel. And the extent to which plastic has risen up the agenda is so rapid. You know, when I was a kid, there was a very small fraction of the plastic in the world that there is now. It's growing just so rapidly that it's going to take a bigger and bigger place in our lives. And there are other threats as well. There are disease threats, some of which are coming out of the way we're doing our food system and so on. So, you know, that's the polycrisis that we are hurtling towards. I've got some very good news about this, which is that from a technical perspective, we can deal with it all. You know, we have the technology we need for a clean energy transition, for a sustainable food and land system. Plastic's a bit more tricky, but we can make a lot of progress very quickly if we put our minds to it. And so that takes us to, well, okay, if we've got the technology, why aren't we solving these technically solvable challenges? So in the book, I describe the polycrisis as a multi-layered challenge. And so the outer layer is the physical side of it. If you peel back a layer, you find that there are things about the way we're doing economics, the way we're doing politics, the way that we're running our businesses, the levels of inequality, our relationship with technology, aspects of education and law and all sorts of things that are also not right, and are hampering our progress. And this isn't surprising, because all these aspects of how we do life and how we run society were basically honed and put together and invented, if you like, in a pre-Anthropocene era, at a time in which we could just expand as much as we wanted to. If we needed more space, just go out and conquer a bit of the Wild West or something. And, and the world was still robust enough, and we were still small enough that we couldn't smash it up in the way that we can now. And it's the change in that ratio of power between us and the planet that means that everything about how we do life, that was honed in a different context, we have to go back to it and ask, well, which bits of it are still fit for purpose? And it's unsurprising that in many ways, practically all of it needs at least some kind of a rework.
I think there's been a lot of good research and I think compelling arguments in the last couple of years around different economic models. And I'm thinking of Kate Raworth and Jason Hickel and people like that who are really looking at economics and continued economic growth as an underlying driver of all of this. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think the logic of the argument that says that our basic economic framework, especially centered around GDP growth, is unfit for the environment that we're in. I think that the logic of that argument is very simple, and it's absolutely robust, and it's totally irresistible for anyone who really thinks about it. So the weird question is, well, if that's the case, how come there's barely a mainstream politician anywhere who will dare challenge it? And it's not as though Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, Rishi Sunak, and the government before that, it's not as though it's too hard to work out. It's not as though they're not smart enough to be able to do this level of conceptual thinking. So something else is stopping us. And I think, so that takes me towards the next level, towards the inner layer of the polycrisis, if you like. It's really a meta-crisis. What's stopping us from seeing the situation cleanly and doing the quality of analysis and the quality of decision-making that is required to sort this stuff out? It shouldn't be beyond us.
So what's it? Tell us a bit more about that sort of inner layer. What do you mean by that?
Well, then we start to get right to the core. We start to get to ways of thinking that we need to get better at now, here in the Anthropocene, in this global challenge, in this situation in which we're all in it together on this one planet, like it or not. And, some of those skills are things like, critical thinking. We need to get better at our ability to sift fact from fiction and work out what is what. We need to get better at global empathy, right? Because everything you do, you can't even make a cup of tea today without having a global impact. Everything has a global impact. So we need to tune into that. We need to learn how to have an emotional reaction when we do something that affects the lives of other people on the other side of the world, even if we're never going to meet them. We need to get better at big picture thinking. We need to get better at standing back and seeing the interconnectedness of all these global systemic problems. We need to get better at abstract thinking, imagining the future. So those are some of the thinking skills we need. But maybe even more critically, there are some values without which we can't thrive in the Anthropocene. We've got by in the past with being pretty sketchy on some of these values. Sometimes we're quite good at them, sometimes we're useless at them. But going forwards, we can't get by unless we become consistently good, collectively, at insisting on these values as cultural norms. And, so I'm not trying to be sort of preachy about this. I'm just espousing these values from a purely pragmatic point of view. The nature of the situation we're in requires us to focus on some values like we never have before. So one of those is respecting all people as equals. And the reason for that is just really simple. It's because the 8 billion of us on this planet need to deal with these challenges together. We will deal with them together, or we won't deal with them at all. And we're actually pretty good at collaborating and being really nice to each other often. At smaller scales, sort of tribal levels, it's just that what we've never had to do yet, and what we haven't yet got good at doing, is doing this at the level of the global tribe. Right? That needs to be, for all of us, our first and foremost tribe needs to be the whole world community. So that's the kind of respect thing. But what I've really focused the book on is a very, very practical lever, which does sort of go hand in hand with the respect thing in some ways, but it's just basic honesty, right? The complexity of the challenge we face, the ease with which misinformation can be propagated, and the quality of decision making that we now require in order to find our way through these challenges is so high that we just can't afford a spanner in the works of anyone playing fast and loose with the truth. If that happens, we need them out, right? We need them out of the process because they're smashing it up. And at the moment, you haven't got to look very far around the world to see that honesty is a real problem. And it's been a huge problem in the UK as well. Still is now. I like to think it's a little bit better than it was a year ago. But, we have enormous problems with honesty in the UK as well. So the book is focusing on this. It's really saying, the second half of the book is all about what does honesty look like? Because it's a lot more than just not lying. Honesty is giving other people the best and clearest view of reality as you see it, that you are practically able to impart. And that's what we need to expect from all our politics. Our politicians, our media, and our business. So what does honesty actually look like? Let's be clear. There's a whole taxonomy of deceit, a whole appendix to flush out all the things that aren't honesty. Because there's so many different, diverse ways in which people can be misleading. And actually, some of the most poisonous ones, are not flat out lies. So that's the first point. What does honesty look like? And then, how can you tell whether you're getting it or not? But what does it mean if you're not getting it? And what can you do about it? So what I would want to say is, I have some guidelines on how you can tell whether you can trust a politician or not. But what I would say is, if you find one clear-cut case of a politician deliberately misleading the public over a matter of policy, for example, it might be, and I'm explicit about these examples in the book, and I do name names. It might be somebody going on the radio saying, we need to take more oil and gas out of the North Sea because otherwise UK energy prices will go through the roof. Right? Well, that's not a lie as such. Well, it sort of is a lie. They know it's not true, right? Because the reality is that our energy prices are barely connected at all to, it's a global commodity. They're barely connected at all to what goes on in the North Sea. And the person who said it knows it. Well, that person was Grant Shapps in this particular example, actually. The fact that they've knowingly done that tells you that you can't trust them on anything at all that you care about. It doesn't matter if you don't care about climate. It tells you they fundamentally don't value truth, and they will say whatever they think it takes to win the argument. So that tells you that they're unfit for politics. Not just in the short term, not just for a year or two while you remember this one thing they did. It's forever, right? Unless they have some quite rare, quite rare experience to change the whole way that they approach life and values, then it tells you they're unfit for the job. And it's more than that. It tells you that any of their colleagues who stood by while in the knowledge that they were quietly deceiving the public, it tells you that not one of them is fit for a role in politics either. Now, when you apply that test, for example, and I don't want to be, this is not a party political book, right? But I do use examples where they are available from all parties, actually. And when you apply that test of who was standing by in the knowledge that their colleagues were being dishonest, when you apply that test, for example, to the last Conservative government, you find not one person standing, not one MP left standing as fit for purpose. So we have to have this. We have to have this standard of honesty that we just don't put up with it. And the way I would describe it is we need to view it as abuse. If a politician tries to make us think something that they don't personally believe is true, that is abuse. And if you vote for them, that's just like saying, please abuse me. I'd like to be taken for a ride, please. So, in the media now, and if you work for a broadcasting company and you're exposed as having groped a colleague, that's the end of your career, right? Because, and especially in the last few years, we have kind of come together collectively as a society and said, that is really disgusting, we're not having it. And that proves we can create a value like that and we can insist on it. And if we can do the same with honesty, then we can start to raise the quality of decision making that we get to the point that we can start dealing with the issues. I've talked a lot.
That's great, and that's really interesting. I'm glad you brought up the this sort of aspect of culture in this, because I guess what I'm thinking as I'm hearing about this is that it can quite often be very tricky for individuals to actually do the fact checking themselves, and often these issues are quite nuanced, and you could be easily misled by something that requires a lot of further research to sort of figure out what the truth is. So I guess the question is, how do we systematize or institutionalize truth telling?
Yeah, well, I've got guidance in the book about organizations that can help with this kind of thing, and organizations that please do, invitation to everybody, please do get involved with them, and there's a whole appendix of this kind of thing. But you raise a very good point, which is that it's so much easier to spread misinformation than it is to put it back in the box. So I'll stick with my Grant Shapps example, sort of without apology, but he's only one. He's just come up by way of example, but he's only one of many, But when he said that about the oil and gas in the North Sea, it took Carbon Brief, academics at Carbon Brief, probably days to put together a thoroughly worked through article spelling out why that was a load of nonsense. All right? But they still haven't put it back in the box at that point, because you've then got to get it out on all the airways to the point that everybody knows it was a load of rubbish, which they never managed to do. That's a big challenge to do that. So it's much harder to put something back in the box. So if you're going to have a climate of truth, you need to make sure that the price to be paid for having been exposed for this is very high, is so high that it becomes not worth it, even when it's so easy and even when it's so hard to catch, to spot. So I have a little piece of maths in the book where it basically just says, the price for being caught has to be greater than the perceived benefit multiplied by the ratio of how hard it is to expose it divided by how hard it is to put it out there in the first place, right? And the way you achieve that ratio is by following that principle that I just said, which is you follow the principle that says, if I know that somebody has done it once, it tells me I can't ever trust them about anything ever again, and that means they're unfit for purpose, right? Unless something happens that would lead you to believe that something quite unusual happens that leads you to believe they've honestly changed. And it also tells you that you can't trust their colleagues. So now you have a situation where somebody's like Grant Shapps is wondering whether to say this on the radio, this thing that he knows isn't quite true. And he not only knows that if he's exposed, it'll be the end of his career, but he knows that none of his colleagues can stand by him, because if they are exposed as having stood quiet, that'll be their careers in trouble as well. That's the way that we need to insist on this.
Do you think we are sort of living in I've heard the phrase post-truth world, in the sense that for many people, the truth is less important than hearing what we want to hear?
Yeah, we've been doing a big post-truth experiment, right? It's going on in a very, very big and incredibly dangerous way in America at the moment, but elsewhere in the world as well. I like to think that in the UK we've had a little experiment with it, and we have, to some extent, some of us at least, learned the lessons of that experiment. I think there was if you look at the Brexit campaign, I'm not preaching for or against Brexit. I'm looking at the way the decision was made, right? That Brexit vote was missold to the British people, right? There were things written on the side of a bus that were known to be misleading. And it was fun at the time, right? There was a guy with a funny haircut who was talking in an interesting way, and there were nice fantasies about what Brexit might look like, none of which have materialized, right? And the whole thing is a complete mess. And now, and it was fun at the time, but a few years down the line, it's starting to look painful, and there are people who don't have jobs who would have jobs, and there are people who can't live where they want to live, and there are people who can't go on the holidays they want to go on, there are people who can't buy the products they want to, people who are out of work. It's, the consequences are coming home to roost. The problem is that truth is, can be a bit more boring at the time, right? It can be, if you don't care about the truth, it's easier to sell a very seductive storyline that's appealing. And if you haven't got in mind how dangerous it will be if you buy into that storyline, if it's not true, then it's seductive. But we need to get through our post-truth experiment in this country and all over the world. I mean, the jury's out as to whether we can in time. But if we want to head off this polycrisis, it's one thing that we absolutely have to do.
You speak about the role of media in the book as well.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so the book's not just about politicians. I focus on politics, media, and business. They're like a trinity, those three groups. And when they're working well, they support each other into good practice. They help each other to raise the game. They insist on each other's high standards. And when they're working badly, they pull each other down. So we've had an era in which the media has been pulling politics down for its own vested interests. The politicians have been pulling the media down, for their own vested interests. Business has been weighing in there, funding the media, funding politicians. The whole thing has just been a mess in which all parties have been dragging each other down. And we need to change that. So I've got some very specific guidance in there, in the book as well, about how you work out how much you can trust your media, with some criteria based on things like how is it owned, what is its motivation, what is its track record. There are a few pointers in there, and there's some guidance on what to do if you're not happy with the results. And it's basically to switch media, right? Do not buy, if we stick with traditional media for a second, do not buy a newspaper just because you like the TV guide or you find some of the columnists entertaining or whatever. If you can't trust it properly and it has a track record of peddling misinformation for political purpose, don't touch it with a barge pole for any reason. Don't give it any revenue stream, which means not just don't buy it, don't feed its advertising revenue by even looking at it. So that's traditional media, but exactly the same principles apply to social media as well. It's really important to switch social media if you're not comfortable with who's running the platform you've got and how they're running it. And there's very specific guidance in the back of the book. It may not be perfect, but I hope it's a good enough steer. There's a list of quite a few different types of media, with apologies to all the good media that I haven't included. With an account, not always perfect, but an account of, what it is about them that would lead you to believe that they are basically worth getting information from.
Yeah, it strikes me as well that in this era, a lot of people are not even relying on one or two sources for their news, but we're using news apps, or we're using social media. We're just getting fed quite random articles.
Yeah, well, it's no good.
Yeah.
If it's just random and you don't know the source and you don't have a basis for trusting the source, then it's not information, and you shouldn't expose yourself to it, because we're all much more easily influenced by stuff than we like to believe. We, like it or not, if you walk down the streets and adverts are coming into your view, those adverts to some extent are feeding into you, even if you're not even consciously aware of it, right? And we all need to acknowledge that happens to every one of us. It doesn't make you a mug if that happens to you. It just makes you a human being, right? So we need to be very deliberate about what sources of information we expose ourselves to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I did in the last year or two, I've massively reduced my news intake in general, and I've gotten rid of the news app from my phone because it was just mostly as a mental health measure, because it was just getting too overwhelming. And I'm now relying on things more like The Conversation, which feels to me much more
Nice.
centered on nuance and truth, as opposed to sort of headlines. But
Yeah, I mean, you don't, with the it's one is, do you trust the individual journalist, and the other is, do you trust the integrity of the network that's put it together? Has it got a vested interest? And I would encourage a bit of plurality, because they all have their weaknesses. So I don't know, if you look at traditional media for a second in the UK, I would say the Guardian has got lots of good things going about for it, in that it's set up very carefully to keep itself structured in a way that keeps itself out of the grip of individuals or vested business interests. And it has a very clear mission statement on kind of truthfulness and so on. And it has a very good track record on all of that. And so, that's great. I wouldn't call it a perfect media source on its own. The Financial Times also has really good trustworthiness credentials. I wouldn't call that a perfect media source on its own, partly because it's got, for my mind, it's quite stuck in the mud over questions like, we touched on economics just now. I think it needs a bit of fresh thinking on, it's quite traditional in some ways there that aren't helpful. And then, you look at Al Jazeera, for example, that's a very different take on the media that you'll get from a Western source in some respects. And there are some things about its ownership that would worry me. But on the other hand, some of the journalists and some of the work that they've been doing around, for example, just straightening out some of the facts about what did and didn't happen in Gaza, in Israel on October the 7th, they've been an incredibly important source there at a time when the Guardian got its facts wrong. So in some pretty important respects. So we do need to absorb all this media very critically and carefully, and triangulate a little bit.
Beyond the sort of individual responsibility, I suppose, to engage with these things critically, do you think there are ways we can push for government to, say, moderate media, or is there legislation changes or rules that can be brought in to get this working better?
Yeah, there absolutely are, and I'm not an expert on media regulation, but there absolutely are. And if we can get to the point where our politicians are doing an honest job for us, and the conversation in politics is straightforward and geared towards the common good, rather than agendas that are hidden away and backhand deals going on and so on, then we can start to, I talked about the quality of decision making that we need here in the Anthropocene, how to improve the media. that is a high quality decision that is required. It requires a very high quality conversation, and that conversation must not be perverted by vested interests or anybody who's trying to confuse the realities of the situation in any way at all.
I wanted to, excuse me. Let's talk about business first, and then I'll circle back to something that came into mind. So you mentioned that third sort of aspect of truth telling within business. So I'll just let you sort of explain a bit about what that is.
Yeah. Okay. So if you ask the question, why have the 29 cops not gone anywhere? Well, the answer is the process has been very effectively and deliberately and cynically perverted by vested business interests who've gone in there trying to deny things that they knew full well were, deny the truth in things that they knew all about, and then confuse that truth, and then create all sorts of nonsense arguments about the sorts of things that will work and the sorts of things that won't work, and just put every spanner in the works that they can think of. So dishonesty in business is incredibly damaging. And now we have a world where it's fashionable to talk about responding to climate change in a business context. And I run a company, Small World Consulting. We work with organizations that do that to try and help them make appropriate responses to the situation, to the climate challenge and everything. And, in the course of our work, we encounter every shade of greenwash that you can imagine. And it's all deeply, deeply unhelpful. So the challenge for all of us, because every time you spend money anywhere, at a garage, at a shop, whatever time you buy food, and anytime you do anything that spends money, you are supporting one kind of business or another. So the challenge is to do that deliberately, with awareness and deliberation. Because every time you spend money, you are pushing for one kind of future or another kind of future. If you spend money on a business that you don't like, or you don't like the owner and the influence that the owner is having in the world, then go and, if you possibly can, find a way of spending your money differently. I mean, even down to, I hope loads of people listening to this podcast will go straight out and buy a copy of A Climate of Truth. Fantastic. But you know what? There are ways in which you can buy that book, which will support good owners who are having a better influence in the world than others, right? Good business models. And you don't need me to name names. I think most listeners can do that themselves.
You mentioned briefly around marketing and advertisement, and I think this is something that is massively underplayed in discussions around climate change, because we're often told that there is rising demand, there's consumer demand for fossil fuels, for more consumption. And what strikes me is that actually the demand is created through marketing, and essentially all of us are being brainwashed constantly that we need to buy more and use more energy. So this to me feels like it should be quite an important leverage point for action.
Yes, it is. Most of the marketing industry is deeply unhelpful. And it's all about persuading people by whatever means you can to want things and to buy things, regardless of whether it's in their best interests or the wider interests of people and planet. And that's just, a fundamentally, mischievous stroke evil way to be honest, it's a pretty grim way for anybody to earn their living. So what's my message? My message for people who work in that industry is it's pretty challenging. I'm not saying all marketing and all advertising is always a bad thing, but a lot of it really, really is. And if you're not being incredibly discerning about the honesty and the helpfulness of the messages and the suggestions that you're making through your advertising, then you're just, you are spending your career doing something which the world would just be a better place if you never existed. That's just, there's no hiding that. media and advertising is a huge thing. Why are we in this consumerist society in which we're all going out and buying stuff and doing stuff that doesn't really make us happy, but we're being persuaded that it's what we need to do and we must be dissatisfied if we're not doing it? Well, it's so mad that we buy into this stuff. So how does it happen? It only happens because we have a continual, well-funded, very skillful stack of imagery and messages that is just pushing us into some mad thinking. So I think another of the really, fruitful things that we can do is if we could just tame the advertising, even a bit, or quite a bit, I think that would have a very, very healthy cultural influence.
Yeah, I think that it comes back to my, about social media as well, because it feels like the internet and social media has massively accelerated the way that advertising permeates every aspect of our lives in a very tailored way, which can be very insidious. I think there's a lot to be said around the business models of what happens if you took advertising off the internet. There would be most websites and social media would cease to be profitable, and they would need to find some other business model.
This is why it's so important, for example, to get off Facebook. Right? You might think, oh well, I'm not really supporting Facebook. I don't pay them any money. Well, 97%, I think it was when I last looked at it, of Facebook's revenue comes from adverts. And you might think, oh, I'm so clever that those adverts don't influence me. But everyone who goes on Facebook thinks they're that clever, right? So, but the guys who spend all that money on making Zuckerberg the second richest person in the world, right? They know that we're wrong when we think we're not influenced by it. So that's why it's so essential to get off Facebook. The Facebook platform provides you with all that utility, not for free. You absolutely pay for it. The money, the money that, whatever value you think you're getting out of being able to use that platform, that amount of value at least goes into Facebook's pockets.
There was, and I have a little example here, but I will fact check myself after this because it was a while since I heard about it and I might misremember some parts of it. So I think it would be the height of irony if I was spreading misinformation during this conversation. But Coca-Cola, the company, ran an experiment a couple of years ago, many years ago. Coca-Cola is constantly advertising. And you might think, well, they have everyone in the world knows what Coca-Cola is. Why are they constantly, marketing to us? And they ran an experiment where they pulled out advertising out of a small geography where they sell their drinks, and their sales dropped like almost immediately because the messaging wasn't constantly being fed to people that they should be having it. So people kind of forgot about it and they moved on to whatever other products. And I think that was a illustration of the fact that actually, as much, the things that form such a part of our life and that we spend money on, if they disappeared, we probably wouldn't even notice,
Yeah, absolutely. So if, going back to the tobacco industry, arguments about whether they should be allowed to advertise or not, that industry said, oh, well, we're just trying to help people choose between brands. We're not trying to encourage more smoking. Well, if that was the case, then they'd all have been better off and all have saved a lot of money if they just all agreed that nobody was going to do any advertising, and then all their margins would go up. So all that argument was clearly clear-cut nonsense, and they knew it. But isn't it amazing how much traction they managed to have with such an obviously bogus line of argument? So, and because it's so destructive, to repeat, because it's so easy and so destructive to peddle misinformation like that, we need to treat it as if we're being abused, because we are being abused, right? So even just one incidence of it is enough to make you run a mile forever.
I have a question on a slightly more nuanced aspect of this, which is something I struggle with within, I guess, the climate movement, the sustainability movement, is honest differences of opinion or differences of analysis when it comes to the trajectory of climate change, how much our actions are making a difference, etc.
Well, that's fine. I mean, these problems are complex, right?
Yeah.
This is all really, really complex. And the science is uncertain, and how best to think about that science and how best to analyze it is emerging all the time. And so with this climate of truth that I'm calling for, there also needs to come a climate of acceptance that nobody's perfect, everybody makes mistakes. We need to allow our politicians, when they're asked a question, to say, "Oh, I'm not sure, I need to go away and think about it." We need to allow them to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, realizing that they're wrong about something, and go and tell the world about it the next day, right? We need to say, "Well done for being so thoughtful," right? It doesn't mean to say that we don't ask, it doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't be asking questions about why they thought those things in the first place. But we are all feeding our way, and we need to allow ourselves to hesitate, to change our minds, and to be wrong sometimes in a well-intentioned way. Actually, we will never find our way through the complex Anthropocene challenges that we've got without a lot of hesitation in the course of our decision making. That's not dithering, that's just pausing to feel our way in an appropriate manner.
Yeah, I would also say as well that it's almost impossible, I think, for any one human being to actually have the full perspective on the analysis of everything to do with climate change and the polycrisis.
Yeah. I mean, yes and no is what I think about that. Because you're right, at the detail level we can't, which is why we all need to have ways in which we can have a well-founded basis for working out who to trust on this. I'm not an expert on ... but I've worked out that I can trust this person for this reason, and that means I can take their guidance without having to be an expert myself. We all need to be able to do that. But I also think this about it all, which is that because the issues are so joined up, they are completely linked. And you can't deal with any one facet of it without having it in your background knowledge, a good enough understanding of the whole picture. Right? You have to have that. And that is why the first half of The Climate of Truth is all about spelling out this polycrisis, sketching it out in all its dimensions, and even sketching out what the physical solutions to it might look like, so that anybody who's trying to do anything has got this kind of background, broad understanding of it. And I encourage readers to, read it and then add to it and supplement it with all their own knowledge, because it's not all, I don't know everything, and build up their own integrated, holistic sense of the whole picture. And then, go down into the next level and look at the politics and then the relationship we need to have with technology and the economics and all of that, and integrate all of that into their understanding, and then, probably most of all, work out for themselves, what values do we need? But I think this, simple empathy and honesty are just, they are just so critical for humans now.
Great. I think just as a final question, what advice would you have for people who are listening, people who have read the book and are sort of thinking, okay, I get it. What do I do next?
Right. Well, I hope this book is pretty motivating, because, let's be honest, the world is it's heading to a pretty dark place if we can't turn this around. And actually, but however dark it gets, there's still things to play for, right? The more we can put in place, what I think is the advice in this book, the better able we will be to deal with whatever mess we get. So this book is about giving agency to people who are smart enough to realize we're in a polycrisis, and they're smart enough to realize that lots of the actions they've been told to take over the years may be a good idea, but aren't enough, right? Like cutting your carbon footprint's a good idea, but it's not enough. And they want to have agency. They're saying, look, this is a global challenge. I'm just one individual. What can I do that's honestly meaningful? And so my book is about raising that level of agency. It says, okay, so the question to ask is, how can I help to create the systemic conditions under which the global change that we need can become possible? And when you ask that question, one of the things you come down to, the biggest thing you come down to is, I can help to establish a culture in which honesty is very highly valued and prized and insisted on everywhere. And I'll start with media, politics, and business. So this is how I should be thinking about my politicians, not just at election time, but all the time. And this is how I should be voting, and this is how I should be influencing my friends and family around this, so that it's unacceptable to have a kind of, a society in which it's somehow normal to even think about voting for somebody who's been sacked before for lying or whatever. It just shouldn't be on the radar, right? So that's the politics side. Then there's the media side, and this is really important because it affects so much about how we think. It's just do a very, very careful job of working out what you can trust in the media and what you can't, both social and traditional, and then switch and make it socially unacceptable. Challenge your friends and family, and I know this can be difficult, but to name a few names, if you've got friends and family who are reading the Telegraph or the Sun or the Mail, right? That's named just by way of example, sorry to pick out only a few, right? Then challenge them on it, right? Do they want to support the Murdoch Empire or whatever? Honestly, do they want to support a newspaper that's been pushing things that it knows aren't true in order to manipulate elections? So it needs to be socially unacceptable to be doing that. There needs to be stigma around that. And then finally, on businesses, it's the same. The good news around businesses is there's lots of businesses that we just don't need to buy from, and we don't need to buy from any other businesses in substitution. We don't need so much stuff. That's great, isn't it? Isn't that liberating? It means that there's not so much pressure to earn money, which means we have more freedom, which means we can do things and bring more quality into our lives and so on. But just every time we spend money, then we should just be as deliberative as we can about how we do that. Oh, by the way, there's a short section in there on banking and a little bit of advice on getting into the right bank, because that is also really, really important.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. Really appreciate the conversation. It's gone by very quickly. And I encourage anyone to pick up a copy of the book to get more into the detail of all of this. Can you tell us when it will be available and where people can get it, and any links that you want people to go to?
Yeah, well, it's published on the 27th of March, and it's available in audio and digital and in print format. And if you're getting the printed version, if you can, I would encourage you to try and find either an online or a traditional bookseller that you are feeling good about supporting, to make sure that the money you spend, a larger proportion of the money you spend, goes towards pushing for a better and more honest and more better informed world.